This is my shop, and I wanted to show you that we moved all the tools towards the wall to get more room for the next project. And you can see here's my welder and metal lathe. Most stuff is on wheels, so it's easy to move. There's the dust collection system. My table saw is in the corner. There's my resting chair. I try not to use that too much. Workbench and some tool chests. There's a shop, and there's the next project. It's really cold in Wisconsin today. It's about 12 degrees, maybe a little warmer in the garage here. I started it up yesterday, so it should fire off this morning as well. Clear and sunny today, but very cold. It's a lot warmer in the shop. It's 65 in here with nice floor heat. This is a 1931 Ford Model A Roadster, 88 years old, built in May of 1931. I bought this last year from a gentleman in New York who restored it a couple years ago, and he did a great job. Susan and I drove to New York, trailered it back, put about 1,500 miles on it last summer, and it's great fun. The transmission, though, is got a little bit of a whine in second gear, and it's slightly hard to shift sometimes, which I knew about before I bought it. So in this video series, we are going to take the transmission out, inspect the parts, order new stuff as we need it, put it all back together, put it back in the car. It is going to be great fun. Take off the muffler first. Pretty simple. Remove the connection from the manifold. And then put it in the pile of parts. The seats are just a friction fit, no bolts there. Remove the carpet. Carpet in these cars have metal snaps that connect them to the wooden floor. Remove the footrest for the gas pedal. Taking the screws out that hold the floor down. Now, I'm not going to show every single screw and bolt coming out or going on, but I just wanted to show this indicating that I put all the little parts in bags, label them so that they're easy to find when I put this stuff back together.
Wooden floorboards. In Model A's, there are two sections. One's up towards the firewall and one's just above the transmission. Battery has to come out. These things get kind of heavy in tight spots. We also have to remove the battery holder. The emergency brake lever is bolted to the transmission, so that has to come off. After removing the tension on the clutch pedal, you can slide out the brake and the clutch. The transmission tower comes out now. It doesn't need to come out necessarily, but it's easiest just to get it out of the way. Now that this is cleaned out pretty well, you can sort of see what we're up against. We have to remove this bell housing that houses the clutch, the transmission itself, and then an enclosed U-joint. All that will come out in one piece. Now let's take a look underneath the car. Since I'm going to be spending a bunch of time down here, you're going to have to come down with me. You can see there's the bell housing, the transmission, and the enclosed U-joint. Now, because this U-joint is enclosed and the drive shaft is also inside the torque tube, you can't break the drive shaft here like you could with a car that had a external U-joint that you could just crack the U-joint and then get at the transmission. For a Model A, to remove the transmission, you either have to take the engine out or you have to take the rear axle off, which is what we're going to do. Behind the U-joint then is the torque tube that contains the drive shaft, radius rods, and the rear axle. All this has to come out.
Now that we have the transmission exposed from inside the car, we are going to put the rear of the frame up on jack stands so that we can free up the rear axle and the torque tube and the drive shaft so that we can pull that back about 6 inches and then finally get at the transmission and pull it out.
Remove the front radius ball assembly from the bottom of the clutch bell housing. Disconnect the speedometer cable. Disconnect the emergency brake rod just to get it out of the way. Disconnect the rear anti-rattle springs from the rear tie rods. Remove a couple more clevis pins to disconnect the brake and emergency brake from the rear backing plates. Disconnect the shocks by disassembling the shock tube link, and this ought to come out, and it doesn't. I had to remove the shocks on the right hand side, but on the left side it came off just like I thought it would. Okay, now for the rear leaf spring. This one is a little snarly because it's kind of dangerous and there's a lot of pressure here. And what I did is I built a little tool to help remove the pressure. And all it is a 3/4 inch pipe I don't know, about 14 inches long, and then also a 5/8 threaded rod that's kind of shaped to a point on one end. And I use that to stretch out the springs. One end goes on the top bolt of the differential housing, and the other goes into the shackle side of the spring. Knock the shackles out, and then once you get the one out, the other side's going to be a lot easier. Okay, now the rear axle and the torque tube are free of any encumbrances. We can begin to push it off of the transmission. Here I am removing a mount to the frame, and then we're going to remove the outer caps for the U-joint. Once the caps were off, I began to just sort of jostle the rear axle to try to get it to move, but I wasn't all that successful. Two halves of the cap fell off. I had to get a little more horsepower. I pulled the rear axle and the torque tube back about a foot, and here you're seeing me lower it down with a jack. And it'll just sit here until we're ready to put it back together later. I also removed the service brake shaft just to get it out of the way when we lower the transmission down. Okay, we're finally ready to actually remove the transmission. I removed 9 out of 10 bolts on the clutch housing in preparation for separating the transmission. Since I am operating by myself, I don't have anybody here to help me, I decided to put a couple of 2x4s on the frame on either side of the transmission, and then put some cross pieces in and attach threaded rod to the transmission in 2 spots. Then I can just use a wrench to lower the transmission down to the floor without any trouble. I think when I put the transmission back in, I may just use one threaded rod located near the center of gravity. I got it all set up and lined up and then tightened up so that the cross pieces and the threaded rod supported the transmission. And then I took that last bolt out. With the transmission supported by the threaded rods, then I just jostled it a bit and backed it out in preparation for lowering it down to the floor. This took a little longer, but it was a lot safer, a lot less chance of dropping the thing or hurting myself. This is the lowering process viewed from the bottom, and I think it's about 20 times faster speed than normal. Sounds like a bunch of bumblebees are helping me out. Nice. I had to jack up the front end a little bit to get the transmission out underneath the fenders. Successful transmission removal.
Well, we finally got the transmission out of the car. That is a fair amount of work for an old man like me. That's it for this video. We will replace whatever parts are needed in the transmission next time and then get it ready for putting it back in the car.